At this point, I'd like to hand over to Nathan Steeghs, my fellow partner. Nathan leads our national climate and decarbonization team, and he was instrumental in developing Deloitte's World Climate Initiative to reach net zero emissions. Nathan will introduce and moderate our panel. Thank you very much and enjoy the session. Over to you, Nathan.
Great, thank you, Andrew, and good morning, everybody. So I'm very excited to be joined by this panel today. We know that aviation is widely acknowledged to be one of the most challenging sectors to decarbonize. But today we've got a group of Canadian leaders with us that are truly, in our view, at the forefront of global innovation around decarbonizing the sector. And so today I'm joined by Teresa, Ehman, who's the Senior Director of Environmental Affairs at Air Canada. We've got Marion, who's the Director of Climate and Environment at the Vancouver Airport Authority. Stukas, who's the Vice President of Business Development at Carbon Engineering. And of course, Nicholl, who is just transitioning from the former CFO role at Canfor and taking on a new and exciting position as the President and CEO of Canfor's newly minted biofuel joint venture, Arbios Biotech. So for the format today, we want to give each panelist the opportunity to introduce themselves properly and give a quick 5-minute overview just in terms of some of the actions that their organizations are taking to support the sector and drive towards a net zero future. At which point, what we want to do is transition to more of a Q&A style discussion. And of course, we'll be accepting some questions from the audience, so I do encourage you to add some questions into the chat. So at this point, I'll turn over to our panelists so that they can begin their flash talks. And Teresa, we'll start with you.
Great. Thank you, Nathan, and good morning to you all. And just to say on behalf of Air Canada, what a pleasure it is to be here, and our appreciation to the BC Business Council for hosting this series of ESG sessions. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Nathan, for your opening and introductory remarks. Again, just introducing myself, as Nathan mentioned, I'm the Senior Director of Environmental Affairs at Air Canada, and we have a team here at Air Canada across the nation, really, who sets and manages the enterprise-wide environmental portfolio for Air Canada. And so what I want to do today is start by giving you, shall we say, a 30,000-foot overview and perspective on setting the context for the discussion for today's panel. And what I'd start with by saying is, in aviation today, sustainability issues are accelerating the evolution and the future of flight as we look forward. It's worth noting that there are two very important qualities that I think bode very well for aviation to meet these challenges. And the first, and I think Andrew mentioned this, and somewhat of a theme of our discussion today, is an established history of working together. And that goes across the board in many respects related to air transportation, but in particular to addressing climate change. In fact, back in 2009, aviation was the first industry in the world to develop a global sector approach on climate action with a 4-pillar plan and ambitious targets. Well, the second point and the second quality is one of innovation. And we've seen a whole history through our past of year-over-year improvements, not just in technology, but also in fuel efficiency. So here we are today, we find ourselves at a time that the need to act is urgent. The science, our governmental and regulating authorities, our civil society, and as an airline, our customers, we see and feel it. It's very visible and alive for all of us. While the IPCC approximates only 3% of global man-made carbon emissions come from aviation, it's really the forecasted demand for air transport services globally, both passenger and cargo areas, projected to grow, and even as we work to emerge from the COVID pandemic recovery time phase. So another way to turn that all around and think about the challenge it becomes this question of how can aviation minimize its impact on climate while continuing to provide safe, reliable air transport with all the economic and social benefits that it brings, using aeronautical science and technology and the right kind of energy, all while defying gravity with every single flight, and do it with a sense of urgency. Well, for starters, one thing we know is you just can't do that alone. In March of 2020, Air Canada announced its particular climate action targets to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, in addition to setting 2030 targets in the air and on the ground at 20 and 30% reductions respectively, and a $50 million commitment towards sustainable aviation fuel and carbon removal and reduction development. And just earlier this week, the global air transport industry has also agreed to adopt a long-term goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And when you look at the pathway to achieve these climate targets, it's well recognized that strategic partnerships and collaborations are absolutely key, and a true progress relies on an ecosystem approach. Or as I like to say, it takes a village to reduce emissions in aviation. The interdependencies between airlines, airports, energy producers, innovation technologies, navigation systems, government policy, and customer demands all requires us to work together to make that happen. And so that same logic applies to how we approach one of the most important decarbonizing tools available to air transportations, which is the use of lower carbon fuels, or as we commonly refer to, sustainable aviation fuels, or SAF for short. So what is SAF? Why is it important, and what is needed to ensure the scale up and commercialization that can happen? To start with, sustainable aviation fuel in its simplest form is a fuel that maintains physical and chemical characteristics of conventional fossil fuel that are needed for safety and reliability purposes in aircraft engines, but it has a characteristic of a lower carbon intensity when you consider its full carbon life cycle assessment as compared to fossil fuels. Some of these fuels can achieve carbon intensity reductions in the range of 80%. There's several feedstocks and pathways in order to do this, and more and new interesting pathways are being developed and in the pipeline as we speak. And they need to be certified for use as a liquid drop-in fuel for commercial aviation. So we don't think of them as alternative fuels. It is in fact jet fuel. It's just sourced differently than our current fossil fuel process that's used today. And why is this important? Well, from a short, medium, and long-term application, liquid drop-in fuels make sense when you look at the technology curve to develop commercially approved new airframe and propulsion technologies in aircraft. You can't just put anything up in the air and call it safe. It needs to go through a long process of certification. So when you look at those timeframes and you look at the capability and the investment into aircraft fleets, they're very long timeframes. So by using a lower carbon fuel, you can see a long, medium, and short-term decarbonizing effect that it has. And in addition, and thinking about YVR as a Pacific hub, that long-haul transportation, flights from Vancouver to Sydney, Australia, those type of aircraft likely still lend themselves to liquid fuels as a source and able to get there. The need for collaboration. So supply chains for sustainable aviation fuels are complex. You need effective progressive policy to support their scale up, R&D, feedstock providers, technology providers, infrastructure, customers, and customer end users. Economically, not just in Canada, but globally, this also has the potential to create regional and local opportunities, a bit of a paradigm shift really from traditional fossil fuel, and support clean technology development and jobs. In late August of this year, finally, Just to say that Air Canada and several other stakeholders have formed together a network in Canada to form one voice for sustainable aviation fuel development and scale up and commercialization in Canada. And, joined with us, and as Andrew mentioned, is the work that Deloitte has been doing in a SAF ecosystem, lending itself and weaving together so that we can create that network and bring together all the collaborators needed for sustainable aviation fuel. So with that, I'll end just to set the scene, sort of big picture for us, and I'll pass it on to my friend and colleague, Marion Town from YVR. Marion.
Thank you, Teresa. And thank you to the teams from the BC Business Council and from Deloitte. It's been a real pleasure in planning for and working with you in bringing this event forward. I want to start, excuse me, with an acknowledgement that the Vancouver Airport operates on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam. And it's very exciting that we're in our 4th year of a 30-year friendship and sustainability agreement with the Musqueam. And that has only deepened our commitments to making decisions that consider the long-term impacts through a sustainability lens. It's an important and a trusted relationship that YVR is learning from and investing in. The Vancouver Airport Authority's current strategic plan was developed to reflect the challenges and insights that the pandemic has brought into sharper focus. Our purpose has always been to be of service to our community and the economy that it supports. And so our strategic areas of focus support that goal, but within this new context. That includes all of our work to stay ahead of COVID, to ensure that passengers and employees are safe and secure. We also see the perfect connection between our work to strengthen our core, to serve as a gateway to the new economy, to fully engage our people in this purpose, to explore new aspects, to redefine financial sustainability, all while ensuring our commitments to the climate move us forward towards full decarbonization. In fact, 4 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, partnerships, people, planet, and prosperity, are all expected to be advanced under our plan. So I'm here today because we're doing our best to deliver on all of those goals. And sometimes weaving them together can be a little messy, and in other ways, it's been remarkably symbiotic. We announced earlier this year that we've been accelerating our commitment to be net zero by 2030. And today are publicly sharing our roadmap on how we will get there. We operate British Columbia's biggest building, which some of you may know is, in some areas, is actually about 5 stories high. And the lowest level that you may never see is filled with kilometers of intestine-like electric baggage systems. And each floor requires people-moving equipment, heating, ventilation, and lighting. And in passenger areas, places to plug in all of your equipment, tenant services to provide you with exceptional food and the best makeup and alcohol on the planet. Not to mention the apron, which needs to be lit and electrified to ensure it's safe and energy efficient. So our terminal is our greatest carbon reduction opportunity, and we're working with BC Hydro and Fortis to make the right investments in energy conservation and fuel switching to renewables, and building improvements to reflect what currently makes up about 90% of our GHG emissions. Our roadmap also includes pathways to further electrify and green our fleets, and to replace fossil fuels with renewable alternatives. Actions under our decarbonization pathways are solid, but they also leave room for innovation, especially some made in BC solutions, and efficiencies that will be realized through emerging clean tech and YVR's digital twin, which is really a replica of the airport's physical assets, processes, and services, and part of the airport's broader innovation hub. For what we currently envision as being the small remainder of our emissions, we'll work on finding new technologies and strategically invest in the purchase of carbon offsets and removals to close the gap and bring us to zero. But we aren't blind to the fact that the industry that we're part of is currently dependent on fossil fuels. We've invested millions into an electrified airfield that enables aircraft to plug into electricity at every gate, thus allowing their auxiliary power engines to be shut off. We've also provided incentives and EV charging for our contracted ground handlers, And that's the airside equipment that you see servicing aircraft, enabling over 50% of their fleet to be electrified, a year ahead of our target of 2020. We are taking bold action to support aviation and our business partners who are working to reduce emissions from aircraft, specifically the introduction of low carbon sustainable aviation fuels, which is of course today's area of focus. In fact, we created Bioport YVR to pull all of the players and knowledge together to move forward with shared purpose. We know that our current and future success is manifested in strong partnerships, testing ideas, understanding the supply chains, and mapping out the environmental, economic, and social implications of both our investments of time and money. Working with the amazing companies on this panel, along with many others, is essential to creating a supply of sustainable aviation fuel in BC. And our provincial government is leading Canada with their work to include low carbon aviation fuel on our low carbon fuel standards. So YVR has a vested interest in representing our community as leaders on this. We all have a planet to save, innovative people to involve, and an economy in BC that is capable of supporting this important carbon transition. And with that, I will turn it over to one of those innovative leaders, Anna Stukas from Carbon Engineering.
Thank you, Marion, so much for the kind words of introduction, and thank you to the BC Business Council and Deloitte for having us here today. Here at Carbon Engineering, we are commercializing technology that enables you to capture carbon dioxide directly out of the atmosphere. That's an incredibly powerful tool on the path to decarbonization, particularly for hard to decarbonize sectors. What capturing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere allows you to do is it allows you to decouple your point of emission from your point of collection. Meaning that instead of trying to figure out how to capture the carbon coming out of every single aircraft or every single moving vehicle, instead, we can do that in a centralized location where it makes sense. Once we've captured that atmospheric carbon, we can do one of many things with it, but two primary ones that we're focused on commercializing today. First, we can take that carbon dioxide and put it back underground where it came from, permanently removing the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and putting it back underground, back in those rocks where it had been for millions of years before we brought it out with fossil fuels. That creates permanent carbon removal, which is an incredibly critical tool, not only in helping to address residual emissions and hard to abate sectors, but will also be absolutely imperative as we look to cleaning up the last 200 years of mess that we've made of the atmosphere, as we go to net zero and beyond to net negative. The second thing that we can do with that atmospheric carbon dioxide is we can combine it with clean hydrogen. By combining that atmospheric carbon dioxide with clean hydrogen, we can create drop-in compatible transportation fuels. We shared yesterday that as part of Natural Resources Canada's Sky's the Limit Challenge, we successfully produced some of that fuel and refined it into certified sustainable aviation fuel as part of the Sky's the Limit Challenge. That fuel provides a life cycle carbon intensity reduction of 70 to 90% relative to conventional fossil fuels. In addition to that, because you're creating it purely from carbon dioxide and hydrogen rather than pulling it out of the ground, you don't get any of the other impurities that, for example, cause the big black puffs of smoke that come out whenever you're driving the sea to sky highway behind one of those big dump trucks. So that cleaner burning aspect can also help with the other aspects of climate change, the reduced particulate matter, sustainable aviation fuel means that we get less local air pollution when we use it as diesel or gasoline. So it's incredibly exciting that we are now in a position that we can say we've produced sustainable aviation fuel. We've been capturing carbon dioxide at our pilot plant in Squamish since 2015 and been capable of producing fuels since 2017. Our innovation center, which you see in the image behind me, takes our pilot plant and upgrades it in capacity to something more representative of our commercial plants, and importantly, allows us to transition to a fully integrated system and our permanent home for testing new innovations before we deploy them in commercial plants going forward. This innovation center is in the middle of commissioning right now, so we've actually captured carbon dioxide from it, which is highly exciting and the result of hours and years of effort from our brilliant engineering and science teams. In parallel to this work on our innovation center, we've now invested over 100,000 hours into the front-end engineering of our first commercial plant, which will take up to 1 million tons per year of CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it safely back underground, together with our partners 1.5 down in the Permian Basin. We're so excited that we are now able to see a path toward that commercial deployment. We've now had announcements as well of commercial deployments happening in Scotland. And we're hoping that we'll soon be able to talk about things coming to market here in Canada, as well as we look to work together with our great partners on this call toward developing that ecosystem for sustainable aviation fuel here in Canada. So with that, I will wrap up. I look forward to our panel discussion, and I'll pass it on to Alan to talk more about what they're doing.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you very much, Nathan, and to Deloitte and the BC Business Council for inviting me onto this panel this morning. It's very timely for me to be participating in this discussion on sustainable aviation fuels. As Nathan mentioned, I'm transitioning into a dual role, one that's heading up a new business unit at Canfor under the heading of bio-based solutions, and also overseeing our pulp operations, and then also assuming the role of President and CEO at Arbius Biotech, which is where I'm going to spend most of my 5 minutes here this morning. By way of background, Arbius Biotech is a joint venture between Canfor and Licella Holdings, an Australian-based technology company. The JV represents to us a compelling opportunity to unlock material value creation using an innovative technology, one that converts low-value biomass into high-quality, low-carbon transportation biofuels and, in time, biochemicals. Licella spent over a decade perfecting this process to convert post-consumer biomass and recovered resources into high-value biofuels. And it's done this using hydrothermal liquefaction technology, which simply put uses a combination of heat, pressure, and water to make a stable, low-oxygen, high-energy content and high-value renewable biofuel, one with up to 80% lower carbon intensity compared to fossil fuels. Canfor, as a global forestry leader with its roots in BC, brings access not just to feedstock and green infrastructure. It also brings operating and capital project expertise and a commitment to sustainable practices and aspirations which can help make exciting bioinnovation projects such as this a commercial reality. And Canfor believes that the forestry industry is uniquely positioned to play a leading role in the world's transition to a low-carbon future. In addition to forest residues, Licella's CAT HTR platform can handle a wide variety of feedstocks, including agricultural residues and sorted municipal solid waste, which provides Arbius, we believe, with significant feedstock optionality. The Arbius mission recognizes the importance of collaboration too, as we look to provide circular economy solutions. And to this end, we have many opportunities, not just from a carbon and waste processing perspective, but also from a participation perspective. And so we're very fortunate at Arbius to be working closely with the Clay Tenay First Nation in Prince George to carve out our path for long-term partnership. This spirit of collaboration is something that Arbius values. It's a spirit that we're bringing to discussions with the First Nation as well as prospective feedstock providers and offtake partners. In our minds, BC is well positioned to benefit from this type of bioinnovation. Canfor's BC fiber and wood residue sources provide great feedstock for renewable energy solutions. BC is close to major markets and is home to a compelling carbon marketplace provided by the BC Low Carbon Fuel Standard. And BC is also the envy of the world when it comes to green electricity, with over 90% of it hydro-based, a point that's not lost on many international companies looking at green technologies. And so we move to the market opportunity. So today, as you've heard, we're seeing across the world an unprecedented surge of demand for products and solutions that can materially reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. This is evident not just in the transportation sector, but across many businesses which make thousands of products that contain fossil-based petroleum. And today, this demand far outstrips supply. The global sustainable aviation fuel market is growing vigorously. Recent estimates suggest a growth from $8 billion in 2020 to about 6 times that amount of $48 billion in 2028. And in various transportation settings, such as long-haul flights, as you've heard earlier, today SAF represents the only viable solution to reduce the carbon footprint over the next 15, 20 years. Early indications from tests undertaken by Argus to date indicate that the upgradability of our biocrude product will provide us with the capability of producing a high percentage of very high quality, low carbon SAF. And so we believe that we can make a meaningful contribution to reducing the use of fossil fuels for this sector over this coming decade and indeed beyond. And clearly, it takes innovation to make this happen, not just at a technical level, but also at a commercial one too. And here too, Argus benefits, we believe, from optionality. Our product can either be co-processed at conventional refineries or with the support of the likes of Shell, with whom we have a global strategic partnership. We can look to upgrade our product on site and produce SAF in one smooth, integrated process. Or we could in the future have multiple regional plants supplying a larger Shell upgrader in a hub and spoke model. These are all development options that we're looking at, but as everyone will appreciate, commercial viability on a first-of-a-kind deployment is arguably one of the biggest challenges to solve for, which is why government incentives at this stage of the game, and specifically in our case, funding that we've received under the BC Low Carbon Fuel Standards Part 3 agreement, has been critical. This past Tuesday, we took the decision to move forward with a full-scale commercial plant in Prince George, a decision which quite frankly wouldn't have been made possible without strong support of the BC Low Carbon Fuel Standard and the Clay Tonight. We're starting with one train to bed in the process, but this plant will further demonstrate the commercial viability of our technology and its application, and a full build-out could be producing 150 to 200,000 barrels of renewable biocrude a year. So it's an exciting time for everyone associated with this project at Argus, including myself, as I take on my new role. And with that, I'll stop there and just hand it back to Nathan.
Great, thank you, Alan, and thank you to everyone for your insights here. I wanted to welcome everybody back and say thank you for sharing some of the bold moves that each of your organizations are taking in the pursuit of net zero. You know, what strikes me as I sort of reflect back on what was said during each of the flash talks is that, you know, I think each of your organizations have really heard the call to action around urgency. What struck me is that you're each taking action now. It's not about plans to take action in the future, but it's about some of the tangible steps that are taking place now. And so I guess with that, I wanted to build on that sense of urgency, and maybe I'll start with you, Teresa. You talked about accelerating the evolution and the theme around working together through partnerships. So, you know, I think in doing that, there's a lot of different players involved, and it could involve working obviously with feedstock producers as well as other airlines. And so I'd be interested to understand from you, what do you see as being some of the critical success factors as you move forward in this collaboration? And how do we ensure that we can achieve the objectives overall?
Great. Well, thanks for the question, Nathan. So I'll speak about it maybe in a Canadian context. What we think is really important and an opportunity that we hope not to be missed is that we have in Canada a very vibrant and smart, lots of cranial power in our energy sector. We have a lot of energy innovators in Canada. We have a country that has a lot of potential for sustainable feedstocks, notwithstanding the CO2 in the atmosphere, as Anna pointed out, in itself as a feedstock. We have a lot of good, clean energy in Canada. And so you start adding all of those together, and we have people who, you know, customers who are interested in making sure that we have sustainable solutions. So from Air Canada's perspective, really putting our shoulder behind how we can develop that opportunity in Canada is important. When we think about other regions in the world, what we see happening in Europe, we see in the United States, we're seeing very different opposite approaches to how to get to the same goal, some more punitive, some more incentivizing. And what'll be important, I think, for success in Canada is how we can compete with those regions, particularly with respect to government policy, and so that we're nurturing Canadian technologies and we're looking at how it can combine to find solutions for, not just aviation, but other parts of transportation and society at large. So kind of a culmination of a number of things, I think, Nathan, and not just to leave it out, although, haven't really talked about this today, is just the aerospace sector in Canada. There's a lot of really good innovation and the quest to compete in that space too. So we're going to see that accelerated transition. People are working very hard at developing these technologies moving forward. So I'll just stop there. Thanks.
No, that's excellent. Thanks for sharing your perspective. And maybe Marion, over to you. You spoke about this can be messy. I think YVR and the airports are a natural convener of ecosystems because you touch on so many of the different key players involved. And so I'd be curious to get your perspective on how you see this market unfolding and how YVR could be really a model to follow for some of the other airport authorities.
Yeah, thanks. And it's great to follow on the heels of what Teresa was just saying and acknowledging the fact that, of course, she's looking at the use of sustainable aviation fuels in Air Canada's operations globally. So the fact that we've managed to hook her onto this panel here in BC is in large part a testimony to the collaboration that's been going on around this table. But also, again, I know I said it in my remarks, but I think the province of BC is showing up as a leader. When Teresa and the rest of us are looking at those areas of the world where we're seeing the use of sustainable aviation fuel, we can steal from all of those ideas. We absolutely know that California and what's happening in the US by way of emerging markets is booming because of the synergy of their taxation, their regulations, and their approaches to low carbon fuels. And so I think with the commitments that we've heard in the last months from the province of BC, I think it bodes very well for the opportunity. Hence, I think all of our interest in seeing all of this happen soon. For us at YVR, we're absolutely trying to play within this ecosystem, but we're also working in other spaces. We are part of Airports Council International, and we are contributing to the leadership space to make sure that other airports globally are working together so it's easier for airlines and the aviation industry to have some smoothing out effects across airports around the world. We're also working with ICAO, who's working on a long-term goal for carbon. So I think it's knowing how to play in trusted partnerships at a variety of different levels.
Thank you for that. I think those are excellent points. I wanted to turn it over to you, Alan. I think the recent announcement of Arbios is obviously a landmark deal for BC. And what I'm curious to know is what were some of the key factors that really differentiated Canfor's decision around being able to make this decision now versus, let's say, 5-10 years ago, when we still had volumes of residual waste product, but not necessarily the product and the market that we have today. And so I'd like to maybe understand a little bit of the thought process that went into making this decision and what were the factors that influenced that.
Oh, for sure, Nathan. So I think it's fair to say the technology has evolved in the last 10 years. This has not been an overnight journey. It's been a longer one, but a very positive one. And I think all of us with the Canfor hat have seen those developments take place. At the same time, we're also like the rest of the folks on the call. We're mindful of how fast this world is changing and the opportunity that Canfor has, I think, to shape the world, given our access to this abundance of carbon in our fiber, and particularly in those areas where the value is trapped. And we believe there's a higher economic and indeed environmental value that can be targeted from redeploying that fiber. So I think for us, that's part of it. I think the sustainability angle is clearly very important as well. And then with all of these projects that clearly carry a lot of risk with a first of a kind deployment, de-risking clearly has to be front and center, and balancing that obviously with the reward, which we believe has tremendous upside. So this is why I was referencing the BC Low Carbon Fuel Standard, because that Part 3 agreement funding that we have clearly has been very important in our decision-making process.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I think, you shared definitely some of the key points around what influenced the decision to move forward with a commercial plan. And I think, Anna, this is really where carbon engineering is at as well, in terms of financing and building out not just pilot plants, but true commercial, first of its kind facilities. And you alluded to the 1 million ton per annum facility in the Permian Basin that's being developed now. And I'm curious to know what are some of the challenges that you're working through right now in terms of getting the support that you need in order to get that first plant built? Do you see it being a regulatory pathway? Is it corporate commitments? Is it both? What's really driving that?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, as Alan said, the first key to the puzzle is that there's been incredible progress on the technology over the course of the past decade. When we look toward unlocking a financing decision on any multi-hundred million or billion-dollar magnitude project, I think that really you look at a three-pronged approach. You need market demand, you need a way of backstopping market risk, and you need capital that is willing to take the risk on a first-of-a-kind project. So when we look to the model in the US, we have the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard that has really led the world in terms of doing things like adding direct air capture to sequestration as a pathway to earn credits. You have the 45Q tax credit that provides that backstop of incentive and revenue into the plant. And then in the US, they have opportunities for capital through things like the US Department of Energy Loan Programs Office that can provide capital for first-of-a-kind plants. So similarly, here in Canada, we have a lot of the ingredients coming together. BC's Low Carbon Fuel Standard is second likely only to California's in terms of its progressiveness and its forward thinking. And we're very excited to see them looking at now strengthening it and potentially adding more pathways into that, be that for sustainable aviation fuel or for direct air capture to sequestration. We see the federal consultation on the investment tax credit for carbon capture utilization and storage being another critical component. So we've got that market demand that's being created through a combination of the Clean Fuel Standard, the BC Low Carbon Fuel Standard, and then pairing that with corporate commitments as well that are really signaling that demand for both carbon removal and for low carbon fuels. That capital piece, I think Alan said it best, that one of the biggest resources we have here is the BC LCFS Part 3 agreements. But we need more resources available if we're going to transition from one-off investment to an entire ecosystem and an entire industry. So I think we look at those three combinations. The final piece that I would add into that is that governments can help not only through well-designed performance-based regulations. It's absolutely imperative that those regulations be performance-based and not prescriptive, because technology is going to continue to evolve faster than the rate at which the regulations can. But government can also provide a leadership role in terms of offtake and signaling demand for both low carbon fuels and for permanent carbon removal.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think the piece that really stood out to me is the capital that needs to take risk. And I think in Canada, this is not something that necessarily we have a long history of doing. And so I'm curious, in your conversations with in the investment community, has it helped to have a broader ecosystem type approach? And are you seeing a higher risk appetite from the investment community, from private institutions to support these types of moves, where in the past they might have steered away from it?
That's a tough one, and as you know, carbon engineering has a licensed process business model. We aren't, as a 150-person company and growing out of Squamish, we aren't single-handedly going to be able to scale commercial deployments fast enough to address the climate challenge. So our business model is to work with plant development partners who can help us to accelerate that path to commercialization. So 1.5, which is an initiative of Oxy Low Carbon Ventures down in the US, Huron Clean Energy here in Canada, Starega over in the UK, just to name a few. So they're the ones who are really on the pointy end of the stick looking for that at-risk capital. I would say on the private financing side of things in Canada, we still have a very conservative approach, and I don't think that's unique to anything that we happen to be doing. I think that's a universal statement that's true, regardless of technology sector. I think we see the federal government putting some ingredients together, things like the CCUS ITC could really be catalytic if it's designed correctly. Things like the Canada Infrastructure Bank or the EDC Canada account could also really help to play a role in terms of stepping in first, providing that leadership role so that private investment can then follow. But again, that's something where really our very talented plant development partners are on the pointy end of the boat for that one.
Great, thank you. And maybe just a question for the entire group here. I'd like to get your perspective on our neighbors to the south. And so there's been a slew of announcements coming out recently around biofuels, sustainable aviation fuels, and the administration support of the industry. Do you see that as being a risk or an opportunity for Canada? And if a risk, how do we manage and mitigate that?
Maybe I'll chime in really briefly because I think Teresa has way more to say on this. But it does feel like it's proving that that laggards can be losers, and that early adopters will reap the benefits. So it's not too late for British Columbia or for Canada. And I think we can absolutely steal from what California has done over the last several years, and what the U.S. federal administration is now activating. We're just seeing even just across the border in Washington State, BP is doubling their investment. So there are real opportunities, and we just need to take advantage of them before the clock runs out. I think we also have a brilliant supply chain. Look to what Alan and his team are doing by way of building a circular economy. And we have a supply chain within British Columbia that will feed this new industry, and so and that means jobs, and it means the involvement of our local Indigenous communities, and it means we're taking full advantage of what we have by way of resources, and people, and by way of and waste products.
Thank you. And maybe Teresa, I'll pull you into the conversation here as well. Given that Air Canada's operations are truly international, how are you working with other jurisdictions, with other countries globally in the pursuit of sustainable aviation?
There's a really long answer to all of that, but and a complex answer to that. I would say that with respect to the United States, what we are seeing there is like literally an explosion of of push behind sustainable aviation fuel development. They understand how it can, I think at the federal level, at the focal point of the government, they understand the economic power that aviation brings to America. And so we're seeing really strong focus at the federal level, the leadership coming from the federal level, in addition to the A4A, which is the Association for the Airlines. And that has made a world of difference in terms of being able to set up demand, to set up the capability to help de-risk opportunities for, that 0 to 1 is the hardest step, right? So we're seeing that all happen. I think the risk we have, quite honestly, is one that also exists in our broader energy industry, which is that, we're not producing feedstocks and technology and shipping them down to the United States for processing and then having to buy back at a higher price. I sure hope that's not the path that will happen, but companies who produce these technologies or feedstocks have to look at where their market is and where their market demand is. So I think that race is on. I think we'd be naive to think that there aren't American interests looking at Canada as how it can provide just the feedstock. I think that would be an incredible loss to Canada. With respect to British Columbia, perhaps maybe one of the best regions in Canada with a stable carbon tax and climate plan that's withstood, over a decade in place. The BC Low Carbon Fuel Standard, looking closely and very encouraged around the inclusion of proposed inclusion of aviation into that. Looking at California as a model of how you incentivize without tacking on all these obligations, which we see happen in some of the development of fuels in other sectors of transportation. So there's a lot of things at play. And to your question about how we look at this, like globally, one thing we also have to watch is, particularly in Europe, some of what's being proposed. They have incredibly aggressive climate targets there and very aggressive blended mandates for SAF at an airport level, which is going to be a challenge. You can create all kinds of unintended consequences with monopolistic pricing, and also how it applies to third country carriers. So you get into that jurisdictional issue of, does the EU get to dictate what countries around the world have to do? And there's been a lot of, challenges along that pathway over the last couple of decades where that can happen. So, but just level setting all of that, I think going back to the fundamentals and even focused on British Columbia, you have, incredible, the BC SMART program, Jack Sadler out of UBC, the work they've been doing, the Bioport YVR, the interested partners, the government interest, the airline interest, and customer demand, and people interested in wanting to see sustainable aviation being there in this incredibly resource rich province, as Alan pointed out, what they're doing with at Canfor and the work that Anna's doing with carbon engineering. You start to line up all the holes in the Swiss cheese here, and I think there's a pathway forward, but I don't think time is time is of the essence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it strikes me that we are in a race here, but we have a good chance of being successful. And I think I heard each of you talk repeatedly about BC's move around the low carbon fuel standard and how that has been a true catalyst in terms of moving forward. The question I guess I'd ask is, what more can we do in BC to support that? And whether that be from the business community or from government, what more would you like to see? And how can we pull these timelines forward?
Well, I think we can start with the fact that, Clean BC was a world-leading climate policy when it was published. The world has moved since then. We can't simply rest on our laurels and assume that that will be sufficient to maintain a leadership role. We need to strengthen the targets in there, because Clean BC only got us something like 75% of the way to our 2030 targets. So I think, you know, as we look toward our 2030 and 2040 goals, I think it's important that we strengthen those targets, that we continue to enhance use of BC's electricity and boost energy efficient solutions. We need to become a destination for new low carbon investments and pollution reducing technologies. We need cleaner fuels. And we need to continue to strengthen the low carbon fuel standard. We have the opportunity to broaden it and to increase those targets. And I think that that's an opportunity that should be taken. So I think it's a recognition that we've done great work, but doing great work in the past isn't sufficient to maintain a leadership role with the speed at which the world is changing today.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And, you know, obviously most of us being in BC, I think we do often feel that BC is a true leader in this space. But I think to your point, we've been a leader for a long time. And the risk there is, can you get complacent? Can you fall behind, right? And so I think you've identified, you know, a number of really good points to drive that forward. Maybe Alan, from your perspective, you also talked about the sort of regulatory framework. You talked about partnerships with First Nations. What do you see as being some of the critical steps to advance now in order to make sure that we can be successful in the long term?
In terms of relationships, Nathan, and building.
In terms of relationships, exactly.
Yeah, so we're a small outfit at Argus, and collaboration is very much at the heart of everything we do, as I mentioned. So the good thing about that is we recognize what we don't know, and we recognize the power of partnership. And so when we have the opportunity to join forces with Shell and work closely with the Clay First Nation, the Clay First Nation, these are all opportunities that we welcome with open arms, quite frankly. For us, what's really important is that we're trying to solve for a problem. And I think we all know what the problem is. And so everything that we can do to accelerate our efforts to that end is important. And so as we look at all of our relationships, we're trying to find fast but long-term pathways that allow us to access more feedstocks at low cost, because that's important for the circular economy side of things, as well as to access new markets and so on. So for us, we feel fortunate that we have access to a very significant amount of fiber through our relationship with Canfor right across the globe, whether it be in the US South or indeed Sweden and Europe. So we feel good about that, but we've got to obviously do quite a lot of work to build out the value proposition and obviously prove out the technology at our plant in Prince George that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you. And Marion, do you have a point you'd like to make around that?
Yeah, I think to your question, and we're looking at a portion of the ecosystem on this panel. Without question, there is a role for government, and we need to complete what the inclusion of aviation fuel in those low carbon fuel standards. And I know there's a lot of effort going on in Victoria to make that happen, but that needs to be completed. And that includes all of the, not just the regulations themselves, but the tax and the carbon incentives that are attached to that. But the people who are joining us today also have an important role, because, you know, if the differential between jet fuel and sustainable aviation fuel is this big, and the regs bring it down to that much, there's still that extra bit. And so for businesses who want to lighten their footprint, they can be making those investments in sustainable aviation fuel. So too can our governments, as Anna has already said. They can be signaling it by purchasing offtake agreements. But I think we're all going to have to play a role in making this happen. I think this province has had the most challenging summer or year in climate history. And they're going to be looking to us to seeing very specific action. So the time is ripe for all of that to move.
I just want to pick up on the piece around the role of the audience, the business community around kind of bridging that gap that may still exist, at least for the interim. A lot of corporates are looking at the use of offsets through getting to net zero as part of their overall carbon reduction strategy. What strikes me here through these types of investments in sustainable aviation fuel is you're not just supporting the reduction of emissions, but you're also supporting a broader ecosystem and making investments to help drive down the cost over time of these fuels. And so what's your view, and maybe I'll open that up to the group here, in terms of the effectiveness of a corporate investing in, let's say, a carbon offset versus an investment in sustainable aviation fuel?
Can I jump in on offsets, and then Teresa, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, of course.
I would just say on offsets, I would encourage everyone to familiarize themselves with the Oxford offsetting principles, which talk about a framework and a taxonomy for making offsets actually meaningful, and the need to transition toward both permanence and removals rather than just avoidance when we're talking about offsets. And that both removals and investments in things like sustainable aviation fuel are critically important to get to net zero, but it's that need to transition from just offsetting to removals. And with that, I will step off my soapbox and pass it over to Teresa.
And that's an excellent point, because I think we're seeing a lot of the international frameworks moving away from just the use of carbon offsets through avoidance to removals and ensuring that the carbon reductions are permanent. So thanks for pointing that out. Excellent point. Teresa, did you have a comment?
Sure. Yes. To your point, Nathan, around, what are we seeing in terms of, that extra piece of, bringing these fuels along. And I'd say it's a pretty bright perspective. We are always looking and constantly seeking ways to engage our customers, how we bring that climate solution available to our corporate customers and cargo customers and others in the airline ecosystem. There is a lot of interest at the corporate level for how we can, assist in Scope 3 emissions reduction for entities, in addition to what really brings green molecules into aircraft engines. It brings visibility to SAF and the understanding of sustainable aviation fuels, and a bit of a teaser, news to come soon on that front. So I'll stop there, Nathan. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Teresa. And really, I wanted to thank everybody here and just extend my deep gratitude for all the different perspectives that you brought to this conversation. I think we certainly have a collective challenge here amongst all of us, and that's including our organization as well. And so I did just want to thank everybody for your time today. Also extend my gratitude to BCBC for hosting this important day around ESG in BC. And so at this point, thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Greg to introduce the next panel.